Hello everyone! Just to give you a preview of what you're about to watch, this tier list was originally part of a Q&A video that I did back at the end of 2023, as I do for every new year. I was asked to rank the roots of 3 houses and 3 hopes, so I put together a tier list doing just that. And you get to listen to me talk unscripted about the various little things that I enjoy and don't enjoy about the Fodlan games and all their controversial glory. I figured that this would be an easy video to put together as I work on larger projects, and that it ties in well with the Fire Emblem discussion videos that I've mostly been putting out over this year so far. So sit back and enjoy that, and I'm going to let the me of 4-ish months ago take it away from here. I had to take a step back when I read this one because I feel like I'm at this point so far removed from Fodlan discourse, because I did that big discourse video back in August and September, and I felt like I got everything out that I wanted to say about it, and I felt like I could move on. But here it is again. I did consider just not doing it for the video, however, I think that's kind of sending the wrong message after the discourse video, because I mentioned there that I was so burned out on the Fodlan games in large part because of all the trolling and the harassment that went on in the fandom. And so by me choosing not to cover it, I'm kind of letting those bullies win, aren't I? It's strange. It actually got me thinking more about how I could go back to 3 Houses and 3 Hopes for future content, and in the near future you may actually be seeing some videos to that effect, because yeah, I think there are still things to talk about that aren't just bad things the fandom has done. If you can look past that and just try to stay positive, or just stay on the messages that you want to put out, then I think I could do that. So yes, I'm actually going to go ahead and do this, and I even found a tier list maker on the website there that includes all the roots. They even have White Clouds and Cindered Shadows, which is a little more than I would have expected, but since they're here, I figure I'll go ahead and include them in the ranking as well. So as we watch me play through 3 Hopes, because one thing I can say about 3 Hopes, regardless of any of its other faults, is that it does tend to be more interesting as something to have on in the background than 3 Houses does. It's a much flashier and more dynamic visual. So with that said, let's get into the ranking. I have 3 tiers here. I even specifically chose 3 colors that would not indicate any particular bias as much as possible. And I ordered the roots in the arrangement that you see them in game. So like Houses starts with White Clouds and then goes forward to Silver Snow, Azure Moon, like that. So that seemed like the least biased way of doing organization here, short of alphabetical, of course. With all that said, let's get started with White Clouds. White Clouds is awkward to talk about independently of the roots that follow it, and there's also the issue that it has an identity crisis of sorts, in that it's really Persona meets Harry Potter that is also theoretically building up to a standard Fire Emblem story. And that is an awkward combination that just does not segue well once you get to Chapter 12 and the time skip. And that in combination with it being quite repetitive from house to house, there's really not a lot of significant changes other than certain dialogue cutscenes, leads White Clouds into feeling, well, not all that remarkable, especially if you play the game a whole bunch, because then you'll be seeing it so many times. It does have a lot of those Harry Potter plot-esque staples, the school life sim stuff. I mean, there's a dance, there's a competition between the houses, there's the teasing of, classes and exams and things like that. But there's also the school mystery, the build-up of this obvious red herring in Rhea, and then at the very end, the mask comes off of the Flame Emperor, and you're like, oh, it was Edelgard the whole time. I never expected her to be the actual villain. And yeah, that plays out by the numbers, and it's okay for what it is. Some of the plotting is a bit sketchy here and there. I think the bigger issue with that part of White Clouds' story is that so much of it is just never addressed again after the mask comes off. and part 2 plods forward as if the Flame Emperor stuff never happened. And you can tell that IS and Koei Tecmo didn't really care about that angle either, because they completely removed it from Three Hopes. Like, even in the prologue, they subtly changed events to where the Flame Emperor just flat out doesn't exist anymore. While White Clouds has issues, it does some things well. Like, I can see why the school life sim stuff would be appealing to some people, and also why that would be the marketable angle that IS continues to push years after Three Houses came out. Like, it's by far the most common source for Heroes alts, and it's also pretty much the only aspect of Three Houses that got represented in Engage, because of how they present the house leaders as emblems, and also how Byleth's paralogue basically has no nods to the actual story of Three Houses, and it's really just, backstory about Sothis and the church, and, they're just 3 school rivals, but, we're not going to lead into a war here, and we don't need to mention the Flame Emperor or anything like that, even though the paralogue is Chapter 11, which is when Edelgard's plan is exposed. So that is kind of awkward, but that's Engage. That's not Three Houses. So I will put White Clouds in the middle because, yeah, it's got issues, but there are things about it that I can enjoy. It does get repetitive, but if you've run this game enough, you do eventually learn the sorts of things you can skip out of it. And I confess there is a certain pleasure to be had in sort of building up your units from the ground up, which is something Fire Emblem doesn't typically do, at least not on the scale that Houses did. So there is that aspect of White Clouds that I like. Other things like, is it just riffing off of Grail and his death, or Zelgius with the Death Knight? Those are more larger referential things that I can't hold against White Clouds exclusively, so I'm not going to. Next, we're getting into the 4 proper routes of Three Houses. Because White Clouds has listed as its own separate thing here, though, I can only really talk about these from the perspective of Chapter 13 onward, so be sure to keep that in mind. I've said this before, but Silver Snow is really the rough draft of Three Houses. You can clearly see that it's where the developers came up with the original concept of an avatar fighting a lord, which, the more I think about it, they've kind of done before with Robin getting possessed by Grima, or with Corrin being forced to fight their family. But here they really committed to that idea, and that's what Silver Snow is. Unfortunately, they then had other ideas that they fleshed out in other routes that they didn't go back and put or properly integrate into Silver Snow, which is one of several reasons that it ends up being overlooked so often. The most obvious one being the Gronder Field rematch, because it still happens in the story, it just happens off screen, and the calendar even completely skips over the month that it occurs in. So you really feel that one missing chapter. The other obvious standout of Silver Snow being a first draft is that it doesn't have a proper final boss. After you get back from Shambhala, you're basically in a playable epilogue at the same position you were in that you be in Verdant Wind, except here there's no nemesis, and so it's kind of like, oh, you're going to take over as the Archbishop because Rhea is dying, and that's what it feels like. And then at the very 11th hour, Rhea suddenly develops Dragon Madness based on this obscure piece of lore that's only previously mentioned by like one NPC in Chapter 2 or something like that. And it's like, oh, well, here's your final boss. And while that is very good for people who enjoy difficulty, because Silver Snow has by far the hardest endgame of the 4 routes, it's something you even feel on normal mode, if you're looking for good story, it just doesn't work. And it's just so obvious that they were struggling to think of a way to end it that wasn't just copying Verdant Wind, I guess. That leaves Silver Snow's only real unique selling point as Rhea's S ranks. And if you don't want to marry the Dragon MILF Pope, I guess you're just not going to get a lot out of this route. There are small moments that the other routes don't offer, having to do with Ferdinand and Sedeth, but then that all comes back to the other big problem with Silver Snow, which is that Byleth absolutely cannot carry a route on their own. They are such a non-entity as a character that you have fans casting around for, who's the actual Lord of Silver Snow. Is it Sedith? Is it Ferdinand? Is it Rhea somehow, even though she's barely in it? It would have been much better, admittedly. I think a lot of people agree that it would have been better if Rhea could have come back at the start and actually been the main character and been playable, but we didn't get that. So instead, you just have this very empty power fantasy with the vacuum that is Byleth's non-presence at the center of it. And it just feels like both Verdant Wind and Azure Moon, with all of the interesting bits from either of those, cut off, and there's really not much to appeal to players in Silver Snow unless you're just looking for difficulty, which is why I'm putting it down in the has problems tier. Azure Moon, on the other hand, is the one root of Three Houses that feels like it really understood the assignment of actually being a Fire Emblem story, because it is by far the most traditional narrative in the game, and therefore it's the one that hangs together the best without like glaring plot holes or awkward pacing or just weird use of exposition dumps and things like that. Because if you took out White Clouds, if we talked about things, Azure Moon only from chapter 13 forward until the end, it could pass for something like FE5 or something where you have a lord at a low point who needs to be brought out of it by the people around them and eventually takes on the invading force that is threatening his territory. And that's basically what Azure Moon is. It's, the Blue Lord against the Red Emperor. And it cuts out so many of the things about White Clouds that were not developed properly and that don't really work because they're not developed. The things like the Agarthans as a threatening presence, they really don't work, and you see with both Verdant Wind and Silver Snow that there's awkward falling action of dealing with them, which feels tangential to the whole Continental War angle. Or even Rhea. I think Rhea has potential as a character, but she's severely underutilized in both of the Fodlan games, and I don't really feel her absence in Azure Moon, that she's just flat out gone from the story. Dimitri basically carries Azure Moon with his story arc and with the love and support of the people around him. Now, I prefer that the self-insert were not so much involved in that, but the good news is that Azure Moon is also the route where Byleth is least necessary to the story. You could take them out and the story would work basically fine on their own, with Dimitri's established support network standing in for the emotional scenes and for the development that he needs to get. You can see this with Azure Gleam, which we'll talk about a bit later. But that's another big draw, at least for me personally, because I never bought into the self-insert fantasy, that Byleth is not really necessary for the story to work. Azure Moon is also one of only 2 routes in Houses that I think understands how to do a proper climax, because it doesn't have that falling action that I was talking about with Silver Snow and Verdant Wind. You get this actual big confrontation with Edelgard at the end, and because you get back and forth between Dimitri and Edelgard, Dimitri, unlike Byleth, is a proper character, it feels more solid and more fitting as a basis than the Byleth versus Edelgard stuff from Silver Snow. And then when you compound this with how Azure Moon is the most varied of the non-Crimson Flower routes, with, I believe it's got 2 chapters that are entirely unique to it, and then it also does a bit more with the Enbar map and the Enbar Palace map, because they're endgame chapters instead of 2/3 of the way through chapters, as it were. That's a good thing. I do like the gameplay and story integration of Dimitri being temporarily unavailable for the monastery stuff. It feels almost like the game is winking at how dumb keeping up the school life sim stuff during a war actually is, by having a character who is severely affected by his trauma not participating in the school stuff, at least temporarily. So I do appreciate that, and from the perspective at least of 100% completionist, it doesn't really affect gameplay all that much. I do wish that Azure Moon hadn't sidelined to do the way that it did. I'm not saying that the route is perfect, by the way, but that is probably my biggest complaint. That and Byleth continuing to have a presence are my biggest issues with Azure Moon. And honestly, if they were both fixed, it would be very close to perfect as far as a shorter Fire Emblem story goes. but it would also be a lot gayer than IS would ever write, so I can kind of see why they didn't go with that angle. I mean, between Dedue and Felix. And we see more of that in Three Hopes, so we're going to get there. But, unsurprisingly, I'm putting Azure Moon in my personal favorites. The lazy way to go about ranking Verdant Wind would just be to say that it's so much a copy and paste of Silver Snow that it can't really be appreciated as its own root. However, I do think that Claude, and to a lesser extent the rest of the Deer, add enough of a distinction that I can appreciate its merits somewhat. However, it is indeed not distinct enough from Silver Snow for me to rank it much higher. So I think its biggest problem is just that they ran into either time issues or budget issues, and they couldn't properly flesh it out and especially develop Claude in a way that feels impactful compared to how the other house leaders are developed, because so much of what goes on with him, whether it's the work in the Alliance Council or the stuff he does in Elmira or with the other Elmiran characters, it all happens off screen, and you don't really get to appreciate him because of that. You have to sort of fill in the mystery yourself, which, you know, if you're so inclined to do that, go right ahead. But there's not a lot there that motivates me to put in that extra effort. I mean, there are reasons that I've talked about previously, somewhat shallow, mostly to do with the lack of gay subtext, that disincline me to putting in that additional work for Claude. The Nemesis battle is at least entirely unique, and it's got a interesting gimmick that calls back to Genealogy's endgame. I mean, that's kind of nice. There's really not terribly much, though, that makes Verdant Wind stand out from Silver Snow, aside from it does have the Gronder Field rematch and, again, the Nemesis thing. That's why I can't rank it very high, and also, as I said before, about the whole thing with Rhea being this very late-game exposition dump, it just feels super awkward. And having the story and, you know, continue on for 2 chapters after you've defeated Edelgard and after they've reused a cutscene from Silver Snow, like Claude's not even in her execution scene, which is just lazy. You know, Shambhala and Talas are just not interesting enough. At most, they survive on spectacle, you know, then the threat of nukes and all, but that's, you know, it feels like rushed, sloppy storytelling to try to build them up as, like, the bigger, almost post-game threat that they're apparently meant to be, when Edelgard's been the one driving the plot the whole time. But, you know, we've got EDM mole men with nukes, and they also have zombies in their basement. So that's Verdant Wind. And whatever development might have gone on in Claude's arc, half of it's off screen, so there's not much to enjoy. I'm putting it above Silver Snow, but it's not going any higher than that. The individuals who've trolled me over the years are very likely under the impression that I hate Crimson Flower and that it's bottom tier for me, following the logic that if you like Azure Moon, you must hate Crimson Flower, and vice versa. And the great irony is that that's not true. There are things that I genuinely enjoy about Crimson Flower, like I love Hubert in basically every aspect. He's hammy and evil, and he's just perfect for what he is. And I do like the tone whenever he's on screen. It's a lot more in keeping with what I would expect of a route like this. I love the Dimmy-Doo death scene that actually makes one chapter easier if you can manage to get it, and it's so beautiful and heartfelt and unexpected. It's like, I really did not think the writers would insert something like that, but they did, and it's gorgeous. I like some of the different perspectives on character development that we get in Crimson Flower because of how drastically different the circumstances are. Felix is a real standout there, as is Ferdinand, although that partially ties back into Ferdibert and therefore Hubert. And on the other hand, some of the things I dislike about Crimson Flower are admittedly petty. Like, for example, I dislike greatly the way that Yuritsa was implemented as a Gota unit, because that is just such a pain to deal with from an 100% completion perspective. And he makes what is already the shortest and therefore least resource valuable route even worse, and makes Edelgard and Hubert worse by proxy because they're locked to it. So I know, though, that that is fairly petty. I do like that even though it's clearly a short and rushed route, that Crimson Flower has more unique maps and a completely different story direction. The changes that had to be made to the story overall to make it work sometimes don't make a lot of sense. Like, for example, you basically have to headcanon why the Empire would not have done what it did with Cornelia, where it took over half of Fargus during the time skip. I mean, the meta reason is that they didn't want the Empire to feel completely overpowered, but I'm not sure they handled that well anyway, because, as soon as you get back, Edelgard's like, oh, let's go conquer another country, and you do it in 2 chapters. That's pretty hit or miss. As I mentioned before, I do not like how it's written to be a romance for the self-insert with Edelgard, half because, I'm not into Edelgard in any sense, and half because it gives the Roots serious tone problems at times. Like, Edelgard will watch somebody die in front of her, and then a couple of scenes later, she's blushing because Byleth caught her drawing a picture of them. And then she spends a chapter holed up in her room like Bernadetta because, my teacher can't see that I have a crush on them. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. This is supposed to be a war story, and no other character is treated that way. You can tell, even when they're trying to build emotional moments between Byleth and Dimitri or Claude, they never get silly stuff like that, and it's so obvious, and I just cannot get into it at all. So that's something that's dragging Crimson Flower down, but like I said, it's got good points, and I appreciate them, at least when Yuritsa is not driving me insane. So I am putting Crimson Flower in the middle category because it does have some good points. Behind White Clouds, though, I think White Clouds hangs together better as whatever it's supposed to be, whereas Crimson Flower, the tone issues and the pacing, they're rough. You can tell that it was a later edition. Moving on to Cindered Shadows now. Cindered Shadows' story doesn't actually stick with me all that much. It's kind of like completely its own thing, but also sort of cribbing lore from Silver Snow, which again is another reason for Silver Snow to not be that important in the grand scheme of things. But the Ashen Wolves are fine. Cindered Shadows is also technically longer than Crimson Flower. It's 7 chapters compared to 6, which is funny when you think about it. And it offers a unique gameplay challenge that you're not going to get anywhere else in Three Houses, so that does allow the DLC to stand out a bit more than it might otherwise. The story itself is kind of hit or miss, but I like Cindered Shadows for what it is. I'm going to end up putting it above Crimson Flower, but below White Clouds, kind of a recognition of it being good for what it is, but being fairly bite-sized even so. It does help that the wolves are all quite likable characters. Probably could have done with a more interesting villain than what we got. Like, I can barely remember Elfric's name half the time, but it's there. And also, for what it's worth, Cindered Shadows gives us, I think, the only named mother with a portrait in all of Three Houses, which is incredibly sad. But hey, Citri is posthumously in the game, so that's cool, I guess. And now we move on to the Three Hopes roots. Scarlet Blaze fixes many of the issues that I had with Crimson Flower. It's the same length as all the other roots, so the pacing is not as rushed. There's no romance angle really with the self-insert, so that's not causing serious tone issues. And aside from that, Edelgard generally has a lot more agency in Scarlet Blaze than she does in Crimson Flower, which is really refreshing to see even from the beginning. And it's not just fighting back against the Agarthans, it's her doing more of the actual work herself, putting more of the thought into the strategy. It's not like Crimson Flower, you come away with the impression that Hubert was behind most of it, like he did most of the actual planning, both in White Clouds and later on in Crimson Flower. But Edelgard pushes back against him from the very beginning, and that's really refreshing to see. There's also that one scene I'm thinking of about halfway in Scarlet Blaze where Edelgard actually acknowledges that she made a mistake by trying to fight a war on 2 fronts at the same time, with her army just kind of switching back and forth between them. It's like, yeah, that's a pretty dumb way to wage a war, and she actually does something to fix that. She makes an alliance with Claude, so yeah, Edelgard's character is generally quite a bit better here because she's not tied down so much to having to be a love interest first and foremost. However, then you get to the ending, and Scarlet Blaze just really drops the ball on its ending for two main reasons. One is that it does unnaturally shove Byleth back into the story. This is the only one of the Three Hopes routes that is significantly altered if you recruit Byleth. And it just feels absolutely ridiculous. Like, Claude decides to stay with the Empire or not based on whether or not you recruit Byleth. And there's no connection there. Byleth has a bit more of a personality in Three Hopes, but their story has almost nothing to do with the war. It's all tied into Shez's arc, which is completely disconnected from the main story. You can see this in the way that the Arval interlude, as I call it, is handled. Like, it's just kind of shoved in there right before Endgame if you got it, and it has no connection to what comes before or what comes after, so it's the same either way, and that's particularly noticeable in Azure Gleam, where Edelgard is brainwashed, and then she's not brainwashed, and then she's brainwashed again. So yes, that's the problem with Scarlet Blaze's ending. The other one is that the very last scene contrives the scenario where Edelgard doesn't get to kill either of her main enemies. They destroy each other, and she just watches them do it. It's just one last refusal to give her any proper agency, presumably because they wanted to go for the cutesy high-five thing she does with Shez instead, and it's just, you really dropped the ball there. I am going to put Scarlet Blaze above Crimson Flower, but only just above, because of those problems I had with it. I will say that Crimson Flower does still have a few standout things, like, for example, it does more with Hubert, and I like Hubert. I don't care for his diminished presence in Scarlet Blaze, but I kind of understand why it was done. I mean, I could do without the back and forth between him and Monica, because it's basically one long joke at Monica's expense, and that's just really a shame. But I am putting Scarlet Blaze just above Crimson Flower. It's not going any higher because it does have issues, but I like parts of it. The weird thing, too, about Scarlet Blaze, before I move on, is that it's the Three Hopes route that is talked about the least by far, which I find a little unusual because Crimson Flower is so controversial. But you have Gold and Wildfire being talked about a lot because people are divided on what it does with Claude's character, and then Azure Gleam appeals to people who don't like Three Hopes in general because it's still fairly solid and also pretty shippy if you're into certain pairings. And there's also the whole thing with what happens to Edelgard and Azure Gleam, but Scarlet Blaze is just kind of there, and I do think that's kind of funny. It's almost like the one thing it inherited from Silver Snow is that it's the route that everyone overlooks. But yeah, so let's actually move on now to Azure Gleam. As mentioned, Azure Gleam is quite shippy in ways that I tend to enjoy. I mean, there's a lot of Dimitri with his closest support network, Dedue and Felix, and it fulfills what I wanted to see out of Azure Moon. It's a story with Dimitri's development not leaning on a self-insert. Instead, established characters fill that role for him. And that's really refreshing to see, and I like that. Because it is still kind of more of a traditional Fire Emblem story, or as traditional as you can get in a Warriors spin-off, it does work on that level, although it does have the issue, as I kind of alluded to just a bit ago, that what happens to Edelgard causes lots of weird issues, like it's just kind of gross what it does to her character, and especially when you look at it's from certain angles, and the writers clearly had some fetishes in there, like infantilization, and, you know, she's just put under the thrall of these two older men, and you can tell that there was like an element of that there. It's also annoying from a narrative perspective because it is a way for Edelgard to avoid having any agency for starting a war. Azure Moon didn't do that. Azure Moon was willing to make her ugly and monstrous in the form of the Hegemon, whereas Azure Gleam will only tease that, but not actually show it. So again, like Scarlet Blaze's ending, it feels kind of like a cop-out because they didn't want to make Edelgard even slightly less marketable, which is just really disappointing for her, because you want to see more out of characters than just have them be commodities to be sold to us in a mobile gacha, but that's what we got. And that in combination with the brainwashing thing and the Arval interlude that I mentioned, and just, it's a route that gets tougher to appreciate near the end, but if you focus on Dimitri's development and the cute moments with Dedue and Felix, it goes down a lot easier. There is also kind of the minor thing that Azure Gleam is technically the roughest of the Hope's routes from a gameplay perspective, at least from a 100% perspective, because there's so many route-locked characters, and Catherine, at least, comes super late, and then there's a few others that have smaller availability issues. But because of the way Hope's is structured, that's not as big a deal as it is with Crimson Flower and Euritza. I didn't mention that either, but that's another thing Scarlet Blaze has over Crimson Flower, is that there's no Gota character there. I mean, technically Leonie comes super late in Scarlet Blaze, but she's available from the start in Golden Wildfire, so that's no big deal. So, where to put Azure Gleam? It's going in personal favorites, but it's not going to go above Azure Moon. I prefer Azure Moon and Three Houses in general having definitive endings, something that Hopes desperately lacks because they didn't want to step on the toes of the self-insert fantasy with Byleth, and I find that quite irritating. In spite of the overall shippier moments of Azure Gleam and the lack of Byleth really being a presence there. In fact, Azure Gleam is the route where Byleth has the least amount of availability, which is frustrating from a 100% perspective, but it is kind of funny to think about if you don't particularly like them. So that's nice, and I think Azure Gleam does deserve to be up there, but it's not topping Azure Moon. And of course, from the way I'm talking about that, it won't surprise you to learn that I'm not putting Golden Wildfire in my personal favorites. This one is pretty rough. Like, there are some good ideas in Golden Wildfire, but they're never explored as much as you want them to. Like, at the very beginning, they tease Claude's conflict with his brother, but that matters for exactly 2 chapters, and then it's over. You also have the massive change compared to the other routes of Claude taking over the aristocratic oligarchy of the Alliance and turning it into a monarchy under him. That's fairly interesting. It's the biggest political shift in the games, period. I would say even bigger than anything we actually see Edelgard do on screen. But not really much is done with that, because after that, it basically becomes a light version of Scarlet Blaze. There's even this weird Agarthan interlude that it shares with Scarlet Blaze. And it's just disappointing because there's a lot of good ideas, but none of them really cohere with each other. Like, where they suddenly pivot to making Rhea the main villain when I think she's in like 3 cutscenes in Golden Wildfire before she becomes a boss. So she's not developed at all. And I mean, Crimson Flower had issues with not developing Rhea properly as an antagonist, but they put in a little more effort there. With Golden Wildfire, it's like you basically have had to rely on these characters telling us that she's this horrible person, or coming from 3 houses and knowing what Edelgard believes about the church, and that's just your motivation for why we have Rhea as the final boss. It's not quite as out of left field as Silver Snow's final boss is, but oof. And I'm kind of indifferent to Claude. Like, I've never really been a big fan, but I also don't really dislike him. Golden Wildfire, from the beginning, when we got the demo, which was like the first 3 chapters, it set up the idea that Claude's story would be completely different from the war going on in the other 2 routes, because it made his conflict about Shahid. So we thought it would be about Almyra and about that angle, Almyra versus the Alliance and that kind of thing, and Claude having to, choose between them. And that's really interesting. I think that's what Claude fans really wanted to see from him all along, is just not be an accessory in the Edelgard versus Dimitri war. And yet, Golden Wildfire just turns around and does exactly that once it's done with Shahid. It just turns Claude into an accessory in the Edelgard versus Dimitri war, just puts him on the other side. So, while I like the alliance from Scarlet Blaze's angle, in Golden Wildfire, it just diminishes the impact of what they could have done with Claude, and it's not really made up for by Claude doing the haha, I might betray you at any point kind of thing, because it's not going to happen before the credits roll, and the credits roll right after Rhea dies, and then there's another text crawl that's like, the war's not over, but we're not invested enough to actually, finish this story, so, watch the credits. From the sound of how I'm talking about it, you probably think I have this great personal dislike of Golden Wildfire. I don't. I'm disappointed by it. It could have been so much more. it could have gotten me to really be invested in Claude as a character after Verdant Wind mostly did a copy-paste job that didn't really do him justice either, but that's what we got. I'm not putting it below Silver Snow because it does have some merits, including from a gameplay perspective. Three Hopes generally has more dynamic gameplay, and I like that how Three Hopes handles recruitment. That's just generally better than Houses. And because Golden Wildfire has fewer playable units than the other two routes, there are certain advantages to that. But it is going below Verdant Wind in the lowest tier. So, between Silver Snow and Verdant Wind. Alright, that's going to do it for this tier list, and with it, this video. Thank you all for watching. I know this is technically a re-release of sorts, but I put together that Q&A video back before the big surge of subscribers that I've had so far in 2024, so I figured that it would be something new to most of you who might be watching, and that you would enjoy this, because as I mentioned, it's Fire Emblem discussion, and everyone loves arguing about Three Houses and Three Hopes. That's just a fact of life and in this fandom that we live in. So go ahead and do that down in the comments. I'm sure you have your opinions on where I placed all the routes, because there are no right and wrong answers here, but, because it's my video, I'm privileging my own answers, as one does. Again, thank you, au revoir.